In this video, we're going to be looking at what's called deviation. Deviation is a result of the metal in a boat interfering with the boat's compass. And what makes matters worse is that interference changes depending on the direction that the boat is facing. We call the direction that the boat is facing the ship's head by compass. That's the direction of the boat, or the course, the direction of the course of the boat by its compass. So which direction the boat's compass says we're heading in. And what we have to work out what the deviation is usually a deviation table like this. Now this deviation table tells us that depending on what the ship's head by compass is, what the deviation of the ship's compass actually is. So for example, if the ship's head by compass is 90 degrees, so due east, then what that means is that the compass has actually shifted 1 degree to the west from what it should be. So if we're traveling in a direction that's due east, then the compass is actually 1 degree west of where it should be. So if this is true north, then the ship's compass would be 1 degree west of where it should be. So what that means is, if we had a landmark, for example a lighthouse over here, if the ship's compass tells us that the lighthouse is at an angle of, let's say, 80 degrees, then the true bearing of that lighthouse is actually going to be 1 degree less than that. So the true bearing will actually be if the lighthouse is at 80 degrees by the compass, by the ship's compass, then that means that its true bearing will be increased by the deviation, which in this case is 1 degree. So the true bearing will be 81 degrees true bearing. Now all of this is assuming that there's actually no variation. but often ships are in locations where we have to include a variation as well. So let's do an example where we include a variation. So this is our second example. Let's say that we have a boat. Let's say we've got an object that has a compass bearing of 140 degrees, and the ship's heading is, let's say, 74 degrees by compass, by the ship's compass. And let's say that we have a variation, a magnetic variation of 14 degrees east. So what we're trying to do is work out what the true bearing of the object is that has a compass bearing of 140 degrees when the ship's head is at 74 degrees in a location where the magnetic variation is 14 degrees. So the first thing that we'll do is we'll look at our deviation table, and we'll see when the ship's head is at 74 degrees what the deviation is. Now we're going to look through here. 74 degrees is 6.5 degrees outside of east northeast, but it's actually 13.5 degrees away from east. So we're just going to go with the deviation that's closest. So a ship's head of 74 degrees is closest to a ship's head of 67.5 degrees on our table. So we're just going to assume that the deviation then is 3 degrees west. All right. Deviation is 3 degrees west. So let's just try and work out what's going on here. If we have a true north, which is straight up on our page, and we have a magnetic variation of 14 degrees east, it means that magnetic north is actually 14 degrees east of true north. All right. We're looking for an object which has a compass bearing of 140 degrees. So next thing we need to think about is what the deviation of our compass bearing is, because our compass is not pointing directly at magnetic north. Our compass is actually pointing 3 degrees to the west of magnetic north. So that actually will put our compass north a little bit west of where magnetic north is. Okay, so the difference between compass north and magnetic north is 2 degrees. Alright, so now what we need to think about is where our object is located. So the object is located at 140 degrees from compass north. Alright, and we're interested in what's the true bearing of this object. Well, you can see from my diagram here that the true north is actually not 14 degrees away from compass north, but 12 degrees away from compass north. And our true bearing is going to in fact be whatever the compass bearing is plus 12 degrees. All right, so let's just say true bearing is equal to the compass bearing now. If our variation is easterly, which it is in this case, then we're going to add that on. And if our deviation is westerly, which it is in this case, we're going to subtract it. All right, which it is in this case. So that's going to give us a true bearing of 140 degrees, that's our compass bearing, plus 14 degrees minus 2. So that's 140 degrees plus 12 degrees, which is 152 degrees. And that's a true bearing. So to summarize, to work out a true bearing, we're going to have a true bearing will be equal to the compass bearing. Now, if it's a easterly variation, we're going to add the variation. But if it was a westerly variation, we'd actually take that away. Now, if we have an easterly deviation, we would add that on. If it was a westerly variation, or deviation, sorry, we'd take it away. Sorry, we should say if it's an easterly variation, we add it. And if it's a westerly variation, we take it away. So westerly variation, oh my goodness me. If it's an easterly variation, we add it. If it's an easterly deviation, we add that as well. If it's a westerly variation, we take it away. If it's a westerly deviation, we also take that away from the compass bearing to get the true bearing. So for easterly variations and deviations, we add those variation or deviations onto the compass bearing to get the true bearing. If it's a westerly variation or deviation, then we subtract that from the compass bearing to get the true bearing. And that's deviations.